Following the dramatic shocks and adjustments of the pandemic, many areas of the global economy and financial markets may be moving towards a more normal state. But what is an economy back in balance in a post-pandemic world? I'm Fahad Ahmed, and welcome to Columbia BizCast. On this episode, we'll drop into a recent conversation between CBS professors Abby Joseph Cohen and Pierre Yared. Professor Cohen is a retired partner and U.S. Chief Investment Strategist at Goldman Sachs, and Professor Pierre Yared is the MUTB Professor of International Business in the Economics Division at Columbia Business School. During this event hosted by the Jerome A. Chazen Institute for Global Business, they take on this very big and complicated question, as well as whether central bankers are looking to change policy direction, consumer and business confidence, and why both are important to analyze and understand the real return of the business cycle in the U.S. and globally at large, as well as whether China's economy can recover following the pandemic and the impact it's had on China's real estate and trading industry. Here's Professor Yared to begin the conversation. Please enjoy.
Welcome to the Chazen Institute's Global Markets Update. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Abby Joseph Cohen, who is a professor at the business school and also a retired partner and chief investment strategist from Goldman Sachs. I'm Pierre Yared, and today we will be talking about the global outlook. Now, the title of the session is "The Economy is Coming Back into Balance. What does that mean for you?" And Abby, I'm wondering about what you make of this title, because last year, your outlook was that there was not going to be a recession, and it turned out to be right. You were contrarian at that point, and you were right. And I'm wondering, what is your outlook this year? And is the economy coming back into balance?
All very good questions. Let me begin by saying good afternoon. Great to see all of you. And I'm delighted to have this opportunity to speak in this kind of informal way. My outlook for 2024 is also out of consensus, but on the unhappy side. At the beginning of this year, which was only a few weeks ago, the consensus view was that inflation had been put under control, that the Fed was going to lower interest rates, perhaps quite dramatically, during the course of 2024. They would probably get started by March of this year. And my feeling was that that was not correct, that this is a Fed that, if anything, was going to wait as long as possible before lowering interest rates, because they didn't want to make the mistake that had been made previously that allowed inflation to get somewhat out of control. And so my view has basically been that interest rates and inflation would be higher this year than many people had expected. And we can speak, Pierre, about the economic consequences of that. But for a moment, let me just speak about the market consequences. Until yesterday, when the market had its biggest drop since March 2023, and bonds also fell precipitously in price, the prevailing view was all is well with the world. The economy had avoided recession, corporate profits would be great, and interest rates would be coming down, and therefore, because interest rates would be coming down, it was a good thing to buy bonds, and it was an even better thing to buy equities, because equity valuations looked appealing with low inflation and low interest rates. I think yesterday was a bit of a kind of day. There were some technical factors as well, so I don't want to say that the world changed yesterday, but we have to recognize that things will not go as smoothly as many in the consensus had expected. There are some things to worry about. And when we talk about the economy going back into balance, I think what the title is referring to is that we are finally beginning to see an economy that is responding to things other than the recovery from the pandemic. And we have to recognize that when you have a once-in-a-century event, it's pretty hard to forecast after that. When you have that kind of incredible sharp slowdown in economic growth, enormous policy adjustments made, enormous adjustments in the way we all conduct ourselves, think about work from home and all the rest of that. It's really hard for economists to use their old models and say, I know what's going to happen. When we talk about things going back into balance, I think what we're referring to is looking at some of the usual economic variables and the usual cyclical phenomena in the economy to try to sort out what's likely to happen next.
So thank you, Abby. In part of what you said, you referred to the likelihood of a recession, and you're a little out of consensus in thinking that it's higher, and I'm wondering what sorts of data you're looking at to form that view.
Well, right now, Pierre, for example, I don't think that a recession is the most likely case, but I do think the risks of it have risen, and I want to distinguish in that regard. So what am I looking at that concerns me? Number one, I'm looking at the consumer being, in some categories, a little tapped out. When we came out of the pandemic, we had an enormous amount of consumer spending for goods and for services. An expression was used, I'm not sure I really like it, basically revenge spending. People taking advantage of the opportunity to go out, buy things, but more importantly, to go out, travel, spend money on entertainment and eating away from home and so on. And that has begun to slow down. That doesn't bother me as much as drilling down to see which portions of the population are showing the biggest changes. And here's my concern. Young people, including people that are mid to lower income, are the areas where I have the greatest concern. Why is that? Number one, young people were among those most afflicted by the extraordinary, let me call them frictions, and unprecedented things that happened in our economy during the pandemic. A young person coming out of high school or coming out of college at the beginning of the pandemic or in the worst part of the pandemic did not have the usual sort of employment opportunities, didn't have, even if they got a job, the usual sort of supervision and mentorship and promotional opportunities. And so I worry that there is a group of people who have had a somewhat bizarre experience in the workforce. We also know they've had a bizarre experience with regard to social relationships. Household formation data, for example, are a little bit odd. And speaking as an economist, when I look at the recent rise in delinquencies for things like credit cards and mortgages, and we drill down, we can see that most of it is related to the younger portion of our economy. And that's disturbing to me because the younger people are, of course, the future. By contrast, and I use this so you can think it through, when we look at older people in the economy, perhaps somebody who bought their home 20 years ago, they have a mortgage at a very low rate of interest, or maybe they have no mortgage at all. And we see that they tend to have older people who are already better established in their jobs and have higher incomes. They're not seeing the same sort of problems with credit card delinquencies. And so we really have this unevenness that I'm looking at. So that's one area. Many of you will remember that consumption is 2/3 of US GDP. So as consumption comes under some pressure, that is a problem. The other area that I'm looking at that I find disturbing has to do with, let's just call it, the financial side of things. There are so many people in this room who have experience in this regard, but let me give you a few examples. With interest rates now somewhat higher, and by the way, they're not particularly high, right? You know, everybody is talking about, oh my gosh, mortgages at 7%. I have told a few of you in this room that when I got my first mortgage for my house in Queens, our rate was 18%. And it was only that good because I was a prime borrower. right? So 7% historically is really not that much out of the ordinary, but we're not accustomed to it any longer as an economy. So we have a situation where interest rates have risen, and it becomes a problem for an economy that has gotten accustomed to basically free money. When interest rates, either nominally or more importantly adjusted for inflation, were zero, and was zero for a long time, people borrowed money and it was free. Companies borrowed money and it was free. You have so many large corporations in the United States who didn't need any more cash on their balance sheets, but they went and they borrowed long anyway because the money was available. By the way, I wish the U.S. Treasury had borrowed long when interest rates were really low, but they didn't. The other area, and this is back to finance, if you will, of where there were dislocations because the cost of money was basically free, had to do with real estate. And here I'm referring not just to mortgages taken out by households, but corporations. And as I take a look around at one of the concerns I have, something that may not play out comfortably, has to do with commercial real estate. It is a two-edged problem. Number one, interest rates have risen, so when these properties need to be remortgaged for whatever reason, the cost of capital is much higher. And secondly, work from home. Vacancy rates in so many of these buildings are now dramatically below where they were pre-pandemic. We have many instances, for example, in this city, where the companies, the residents, if you will, who use those office spaces are saying, wait a second, why am I paying X dollars per square foot for Class B space? I can move into Class A. And we're seeing that Class A space, that is the really high quality stuff, in this city and many other cities is doing quite well. That's not where the problem is. The problem is Class B, Class C, where the vacancy rates have literally skyrocketed, and the owners of those buildings are facing a problem. Do they remortgage at higher rates when they don't have very much income coming in? And we see in a number of cities that they're walking away from those buildings. This creates a problem for the lenders, right? It also creates a problem for those local communities, because what happens to the property taxes that are due on these properties? Number one, let's say somebody, the owner in goodwill, says, I'm going to continue to pay my property tax, I'm not going to walk away totally, but the appraised value of the property is now reduced by 25% or 50%. The taxes go down, and that city or community feels the pinch. That is certainly one possibility and problematic because the services being provided by that city or community have not moved down in the same sort of way. I'm going to stop talking there, but with one postscript, and that is it's not just the United States. We're seeing these kinds of pressures as well in other economies. China is the big one. China is one country where there has been enormous investment in real estate, not just on the corporate side, but also by households. Something like 20 to 25% of the Chinese households that own real estate own more than one property. It was viewed as an investment, and it's shades of what happened here in the United States before the global financial crisis.
Thanks, Abby. I'm glad you brought up China. And I'm going to ask you this question, both it's going to relate to the Fed as well as China. It seems that last year's forecasts were quite wrong. The consensus was quite wrong on China and also quite wrong on the Fed. In particular, for the last 2 years, the Fed has hiked rates much faster than anyone anticipated. Right. And most likely, based on what we've discussed, they'll hold for much longer than anyone anticipates. Also last year, as soon as China decided to open up, there was tremendous optimism about growth in China, and that optimism has slowly faded. And I'm wondering, why is it that it does seem like the forecasts have been, or the consensus has been more wrong than usual? And you touched a little bit on this in the sense that it's post-COVID and so on, but I was wondering if you could elaborate and in particular speak to what how the structure of the global economy may be permanently shifting.
Yeah. Those are both very big questions, specifically what's happened to the forecasting community and then what's happened to China. So let's talk about the forecasting community more generally. There is a tendency among forecasters, and this, by the way, is my background, so I'm kind of dissing on myself as well. I'm dissing on the people who are trained the same way I was. You start with a database. You start with the data, and then you build a model. And the model is great at predicting the past. Maybe not so good at predicting the future, particularly if there is a structural change. So for example, when I was building such models, when I worked at the Federal Reserve in Washington, we did not properly at that time account for what was happening in the rest of the world. The sense was the United States was so critical to the local community, the local economy, that what was happening outside the United States was in many ways just statistical noise. And that was a pretty good assumption for many years until it was wrong. And we have so many comparable examples right now post-pandemic. And I think that if we went around this room, everyone here could identify something that has been a major structural change, whether it is something like work from home, whether it is something like the move from urban to suburban areas, whether it is how we approach, for example, the use of capital and the cost of capital. There are any number of things that we could all point to. And when we turn our attention to China, those issues are dramatically magnified in the following way. Number one, there's never really a high level of confidence in the data that we're getting from China. I think those data have improved dramatically in recent years, but we're never really sure if it's accurate, number one. Number two, the Chinese government over the last couple of years has actually stopped reporting certain items. I mentioned before my concern about young people here in the United States. The Chinese government stopped reporting related data to their young population. They just stopped reporting it. So when we look at China, and I'm doing this as a preamble, if you will, yeah, it's tough to forecast. But what did forecasters, what did investors get wrong over the last year or two in anticipation of the reopening of the economy? Number one, let's keep in mind that the Chinese economy was closed on purpose because the Chinese authorities thought that that would be the best way to handle the pandemic. The Sinopharm vaccine, I have to say, was basically ineffective. It had something like a 20 to 25% efficacy rate compared to 85 to 90% for the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccines, the vaccines used in Europe and so on. The Chinese didn't want to use anybody else's vaccine, so if you don't have an efficacious vaccine, what do? You put everybody in isolation when they're sick. They shut down the economy. The mistake I think that many forecasters made was to think that when that economy reopened, it would be sort of like, oh, they'd been in a case of suspended animation, and then they would just proceed on where they were. The problem is that the rest of the global economy had changed in the interim. For example, supply chains had changed. Many companies had become less dependent upon their Chinese sources and suppliers, and they had moved to other places in Southeast Asia. They had nearshored to Mexico and so on. And so a lot of the demand that one might have expected previously simply wasn't there in terms of outside markets, number one. Number two, domestically, when things reopened, the average Chinese consumer wasn't feeling all that good. being in lockdown basically had taken away a lot of the dynamism of the local domestic economy. That was one significant issue. And the other, of course, is related to what we mentioned a few minutes ago, and that has to do with the property markets. By the time the Chinese economy reopened, it was already clear that the rise in global interest rates and cost of capital was causing problems in the real estate markets in China, which were dramatically levered. So if you have, I'll call it over-levered, if you have a sector which is dramatically over-levered, interest rates are rising and diminished demand, it's not a pretty picture. Now, I have dramatically oversimplified the situation, but I think you get a general sense of why that consensus forecast that was so positive about China was simply wrong. One other thing, if I may, I know there are a lot of international students here. The capital that had flowed so easily into China pre-pandemic had stopped. And the data we now have for the year just passed shows that FDI going into China for the first time since it's been collected over the last several decades was actually a negative number this past year. Think of this, no net foreign direct investment going into China, and interestingly, net no foreign direct investment coming out of China either. Enormous, enormous change in the Chinese perspective and position in the global economy.
Thank you, Abby.
Okay.
So if we think about the Chinese economic slowdown, but you're an international investor, you're looking at the globe and you're interested in some emerging market exposure.
Right.
What are the types of principles that you should use in thinking about that?
I always look at things in a couple of different ways. Number one, I would prefer to invest in an economy in which I have some confidence in the future path. Doesn't have to be great right now, but there has to be a productive, positive pathway. Number two, I'm looking for value. If something is already priced as if it's wonderful, I don't see much of an opportunity. I'd rather invest, and I'm not a contrarian by nature, but I would rather invest someplace where the good news is not already fully reflected. And so along those lines, there are, I think, some interesting opportunities in the following way. Number one, if we look at Europe, the European economies have been struggling. Some of them have been treading water. Germany is having some big trouble. The UK is taking a long, long time to get its traction, but it's priced that way already. And if I compare the valuations of these markets relative to the United States, I think it's not looking so bad. And by the way, we have to keep in mind that there's a different industrial composition in the different markets. We all know about the Magnificent Seven. Here in the United States, our S&P and certainly our NASDAQ are dominated by technology companies. Tech companies have higher growth rates, they have higher PEs and so on. But if you were to level set our market versus the markets in other countries for their sectoral weightings, what we basically find is that there are some opportunities. So for example, some of these other markets are much more heavily weighted in things like financial services. If you think the globe has now done what it's going to do in terms of raising interest rates, and oh, by the way, interest rates may come down a little bit sooner in Europe than in the United States, that may be an opportunity. The other issue, specifically with regard to emerging markets, has to do with recognizing that, in my view, emerging markets is not one category. You know, we say, developed markets, emerging markets, which one do you like better? I would prefer to look at it country by country, because emerging markets and developed markets are idiosyncratic. There are different things happening in different economies. I see, for example, that there are some opportunities in some of the East Asian and Southeast Asian markets. There are opportunities in some of the Latin American markets and so on. But here's where I would be wary, and that is, in many cases, particularly in emerging markets, they tend to be dominated by a handful of industries. Typically something like finance, or in the case of a commodity producer, commodity producing nation, those mining companies and so on. And I typically prefer a much more active approach, active selection approach, rather than just going with the market weights in a particular country.
Thank you, Abby. Speaking about markets, part of the big run-up in the stock market over the past year, actually the past few months, let's say, has been because of euphoria over AI. And I'm wondering what you make of that euphoria, whether it's justified, and what is it that people get right and investors are getting right and investors are not necessarily getting right?
Okay. I think what investors and everyone else is getting right about AI is that this is a big deal. This is an enormous technological shift in our economy, and it will occur in a number of other economies around the world as well. This is news. Now, let's back up a little bit. AI has been with us probably 3 decades. In case you haven't thought about it, I've got a really old clothes dryer in my apartment that has AI in it. It figures out whether my stuff is sufficiently dry to turn off. That is a form of AI. So this is really not new. What is new is Gen AI, generative AI, which takes the large data set, it takes the information that is available, and not only analyzes things very quickly in terms of the current situation, but also projects, makes assumptions, and the proponents will say it thinks, and it moves quickly, and we have become accustomed, actually, for more than a century, in terms of using automation to take it over very rote tasks. We've seen it in manufacturing, for example. What's different about generative AI is the potential risk. I use that charged word on purpose. The potential risk, but also the potential opportunity for things related to white-collar positions, including things that are very rote. And the way I like to look at it is it's going to go in phases. We are, in some ways, the very early phase of Gen AI. This is the phase where there is a lot of initial research still going on at the corporate level and at the government level, and interestingly, importantly, at the academic level. Number 2, this is still early stages in terms of investment. Companies putting in the hardware, putting in the software, and putting in the time to figure out whether they can use Gen AI. And many companies are taking baby steps. There are some industries that are moving ahead more quickly than others. We're not going to know, in my view, for quite some time, how the next phase is going to affect employment and so on. But Pierre, you earlier made an interesting observation about whether Gen AI creates an enhancement to productivity and what the difference is for the economy. So if you want to speak about that for a moment.
Sure, yeah, thank you. Well, I'm usually the one interviewing, but I'm happy to talk about it. So I think the way you want to think about these sorts of technological innovations is you can categorize them in a 2x2 matrix in terms of, did they save you on labor or did they augment labor? And that would have redistributive implications for whether the owners of companies are going to benefit more than the workers within companies. And then the other feature of it is whether it's going to benefit the high-skilled workers versus the low-skilled workers. And we've sort of moved in a direction over the past few decades, taking for granted that technological innovations are labor-saving and they benefit high-skilled workers versus low-skilled workers. But that is not necessary for technological innovation. And in fact, technological innovations from the the past have had different features. If you consider the factory, for example, the factory is labor augmenting, and also because you need factory workers inside the factory to do things, and it also is benefits low-skilled workers to the detriment of high-skilled workers like high-skilled artisans. So that's what happened in the Industrial Revolution. And one big question to think about with generative AI would be, who is going to benefit relatively, the high-skilled workers or the low-skilled workers? You mentioned the white-collared workers might be hit. I think perhaps about high-skilled programmers who realize that a lot of low-skilled programmers can just do their job just as well. Yep. And the other thing to consider is, to what extent does this, and I don't know the answer to either of these questions, but to what extent does this enhance the operation of a human being, or versus simply replace them the way that automation has replaced a lot of jobs?
Yep. We also need to recognize that there are some obstacles at this point. It's not going to be smooth sailing. One is it's expensive. And thus far, only some fairly large companies have been able to sit back and try to develop the appropriate tools and applications. Number two, some of what we need is not available. The fact that not all the chips we need are produced in the United States. In fact, many of them are produced outside the United States. And are there security concerns for the United States? And by the way, for other nations, say, let's call them NATO nations, that may not have access to everything that's needed. What are the regulatory implications? Government tends to move very, very slowly. We know that government was years and years behind where perhaps people wanted them to be with regard to social media, other aspects of the internet. Where are they on Gen AI? So there are lots of things that haven't been resolved. When I speak to computer scientists, they think too about the following, and that is, these models don't work all that well. I say that with a smile because they do incredible things, but they're not reliable. There have been a number of pilot projects that have been done in which scientists, for example, and medical researchers have fed data, specifically cleansed, correct data into these models. So we're not talking about things that the systems pulled in from wherever, but clean, filtered data, and the hallucination rate is still very high, something approaching 20%. Now, if you are doing medical research, or you're doing some kind of scientific research, or you're doing something where precision matters, a 20% hallucination rate is simply unacceptable. If you are using Gen AI to write your emails for you, and a 20% hallucination rate is acceptable to you, okay, fine, wouldn't be acceptable to me, because I would still want to look things over, which leads to my last point. At this stage, people who are more expert in this field than I believe that there will be, at least for some time to come, a need for skilled people to actually review the output of Gen AI models to make sure they're correct, to make sure that the information that's coming out makes sense. And for those of you who may have been around in the New York area this time last year, you may recall the case of a lawyer who had used an early version of ChatGPT to develop a legal brief, which he submitted to a court. And the judge threw it back and said, by the way, the cases that are cited do not exist. ChatGPT hallucinated much of what was in that legal brief. I think the guy was threatened with disbarment. I'm not exactly sure where that ended up, but clearly he did not, it did not reflect well on his professionalism. And so for quite some time to come, we're going to have these issues in terms of what can you use Gen AI for? I think it's more than a toy. Don't misunderstand, but it has to be used carefully.
Abby, one of the things you mentioned about how much investment is going on right now, and we discussed this earlier also, suggests that all the hope that AI is somehow going to be disinflationary right now is perhaps overstated, because there's just so much spending right now on investing, and the fruits of those investments will take time to materialize. If you know, for example, that there were significant investments in computing technology which were made in the 70s, which was an inflationary period, and it took 2 decades for those investments to materialize in the productivity boom of the 1990s. Now, it may not take 20 years in this case, but it does take time.
Yeah, there's also a more recent experience than that. Some of you, I suspect, remember Y2K. You know, as we approached the year 2000, there was a lot of concern that computer systems simply couldn't handle it because of the rollover to the next century, because so many of the older systems had, in order to save memory, it used to be that memory was very expensive. I know this sounds so odd to so many of you, but memory used to be very expensive, and so it was actually worth the while of the computer programmer not to code things as 1988, but to save those 2 digits and just say 88. So what was going to happen when you moved into year 2000? Would the computer systems know what to do? And in anticipation of that, we had approximately 3 years of computer equipment expenditures, 3 years worth in 1999. And so it took us another couple of years to use that up. We may have a similar kind of situation right now where there's a great deal of spending. And I would say that there is also an excuse being given, pardon me for presenting it this way, I'm just trying to be a little bit provocative. Some companies saying, we have to fire 300 people because of our investments in AI, and we need different people. We all know that so many of these companies consciously overhired during the pandemic, right? Because they were concerned they wouldn't be able to hire enough people. So they went on a hiring spree. So what I view as, I hate to use this expression, a natural culling right now, perhaps of the bottom performers in their category, they're giving everybody cover by saying, it's not because we hired improperly, it's because AI is out there. I think that we all need to look at some of those comments in the press and view them with a little more cynicism.
Thank you, Abby. I'd like to turn it over to our audience to see if we have questions from our other faculty or students. Yes?
Thank you. Thank you for the interesting talk. I was wondering how and whether the economy factors in the upcoming elections in the United States.
Did everyone hear the question? It had to do with the upcoming elections, and S at the end, in the United States. And they're, by the way, important elections in many other countries as well. There are important elections, general elections in Europe and Latin America and so on. We just had this big election in Taiwan, for example, with geopolitical consequences. I do consider this election in the United States to be one of great consequence. And we, by the way, are already seeing the effects of it. So, for example, the decision taken by the Republicans in the House of Representatives last week not to approve a compromise that had been hammered out over the course of several months with regard to the migration bill plus the funding for Ukraine, Israel, and other allies of the United States. By the way, it's actually a much more complicated funding bill than has been presented in the media. So the fact that the Republicans basically said, in preparation for the campaign, we want to stake out this position. So we're already seeing the effects. I'm very concerned about it. I'm also concerned about what happens over the next few weeks. Let's not forget that on March 1 and March 8, the federal government could shut down. at least portions of it, because the House never sufficiently funded the current year budget. And so we're operating on a continuing resolution. And so I do worry that the elections are already having an impact. And by the way, not a good impact, because the decisions being made in the Congress are not being made on the basis of policy, but rather on the basis of political advantage. And that to me is worrisome. There are a number of other things to take into consideration at the state and local side in the United States. There are a number of communities that are feeling the after effects of the pandemic. For example, some of the urban areas that lost population, lost tax base, and so on during the pandemic. And we need to think through what the appropriate policies are in all of those categories.
Jesse?
Yeah. Abby, what's your view of the continuing prosecution of the war in the Ukraine on the economy in the U.S. and Europe?
Mm-hmm. With regard to the war in Ukraine, I take the point of view, and I'm not an expert on military strategy, nor I'm an economics and market person. But my view as an individual is that we need to continue to support the Ukrainians because of what it means with regard to the safety and security of our allies in Europe. I also think that there is a gross misunderstanding on the part of some in this country about what it means to spend $60 billion for Ukraine. That is money that by and large is spent in the United States. What we have done as a country since the original Russian invasion of Ukraine is we're taking armaments out of our stockpiles here in the United States for our military, giving it to Ukraine, and the money that has been, quote, spent for Ukraine thus far has actually been spent in the United States to manufacture more rockets, more armaments, and so on. If you follow, where this stuff gets built, it is largely in red states. So it's interesting to me that the red states are the ones that are opposing this legislation now. So I think that support of NATO is critically important. I do worry about what happens to the perceived role and actual role of the United States if we move away from this. After the Second World War, a system, a multilateral system was created basically as the United States wanted it created. NATO, the United Nations, but also all of the financial institutions, World Bank, IMF, and so on, where the United States played a very significant role in developing these. And I worry that if we step back from our leadership role, that we will be viewed as a lesser nation. And I, for one, think that that is not necessary. Not that I'm not an internationalist. I am very happy to see great success in other countries, but I don't want to see the United States receding from an appropriate role.
Hello, Professor Cohen. So I was just wondering, what is your expectation on the bubble burst of China's property market, where it caused a stagnation of the Chinese economy that lasts for another 2 to 3 decades, like what we observed in Japan in 1990s? Thanks.
That is a wonderful question, and I am not an expert on China. So let me share with you what I am hearing from the people to whom I speak who know far more than I. They have very significant concerns about, number one, how long it will take for the property bubble to work its way out. Number two, there are concerns still about the quality of the accounting, so we don't know the full extent of it. Number three, there are concerns about the population bust in China. One of the reasons that the U.S. grew so much more quickly than other developed economies over the last 20 years, including in Europe, is that we had faster population growth. And one of the similarities now between China and Japan during their deflationary years is a reduction in labor force and a reduction in population. And that, of course, takes many years to resolve. And then the other piece of concern about China is the one I mentioned before, and that is that during the shutdown of the Chinese economy for public health reasons, the rest of the world found other business opportunities and other trade partners. Can China restore that? I think that China has the ability to restore that, but it has to be done in a different way. It's no longer on the basis of low-cost producer. It's on the basis of something where I think China is not getting sufficient credit, and that is a very strong multi-decade program of investment in research, investment in technology, investment in education. The Chinese government for many years now has been building university capacity. They have been investing heavily in various forms of engineering and technology. Satellite technology, for example, and so on, is actually quite robust in China. So I'm hoping that these are things that are used for commercial benefit and not just for military advantage.
There's a question in the back.
Hello, Abby. David Foy, first-year business student. Do you see a world where the Fed abandons its 2% inflation target, given how sticky inflation has been?
The answer is no, I don't. I think this is a Fed that is very serious about its 2% target. Whether it should be 2% or not, we can have an agreement or disagreement. I, for one, think that 2% is a little bit arbitrary, particularly since there are some aspects of the data and changes in the structure of the economy that suggest to me it shouldn't be 2%. But I think they are so concerned about maintaining their credibility during this period that they're going to stick with it. And unless there are signs of a real recession, I think that they're going to hang tough on this. What I do worry about is what we know from monetary policy going back decades is the Federal Reserve is always late, right? They're always late to change direction. And so by the time they see clear evidence that there is a recession or impending recession, it's probably already too late to have an impact. But we'll see what happens. I think that they still believe that they need to be hawkish on inflation because they're afraid of letting it out of control.
Thank you. I know you mentioned commercial real estate as a sector that you were worried about. I don't know if there are any other sectors that you think like you should be looking out for or that concern you.
Commercial real estate is at the top of my list because it's big and in some ways it's unknowable. The one thing about commercial real estate is this. It's there, right? If you have a facility, a service facility or something like that, and you don't like what's happening in that city, you move someplace else. You can't move a big building. So it kind of like complicates, if you will, a lot of the political element of what's going on. So let me answer your question about what else we should be looking at. I mentioned the consumer, especially young people. I am worried about that. I'm worried about what happens in terms of the student debt overhang for many young people and their households. I worry about the inappropriate use of credit. You know, people felt so good about getting, I'll call them subsidies from the federal government during the pandemic, that some households are having a problem adjusting back to the reality of only spending what you're earning, and so on. So these are concerns of mine. And I think that there would be specific industries and sectors that would feel the pinch more than others, number one. With regard to business spending, so far, so good. Businesses have been investing in equipment. They have been using their cash, which is pretty good. Their balance sheets are robust. But I would be watching this quite carefully because business confidence, to me, is essential. You know, everybody talks about consumer confidence. Let me come back to business confidence in a moment. Consumer confidence, I don't know if you've seen the surveys, looks terrible, right? Consumers are just not confident in the future. Then why is everybody spending, right? So to me, the single best metric of consumer confidence is whether people are spending, but there's this huge gap between what people are saying they're doing versus what they say is happening in the rest of the economy. It's the strangest thing because there are surveys that say, how's your household? And everybody says good. And when they're asked the question, and what about the rest of the economy? They say, not so good. So we've got this weird gap. And you know, we can talk about the psychological reasons for that and so on. We focus a lot on this kind of measure of confidence. We don't focus enough on business confidence measures because if business confidence erodes, either because of, to your question, geopolitics, worried about election, worried about changes in government policy and so on, or if businesses are nervous about any other of a whole host of issues and they stop spending, that to me is a problem. What do they stop spending on? Well, we think about equipment and inventory. They stop spending on workers, right? If they stop hiring, that to me is very problematic. So I'm actually looking at business confidence to a very significant degree. And then the third thing I'm looking at is trade. I worry that because of the geopolitical pressures, there could be errors made in trade policy. There could be problems we encounter because our trade partners are not doing so well. You know, let's keep in mind that for many, many years, single most important trade partner of the United States is the rest of North America. I know there was a big fuss made a few weeks ago about, oh, China's no longer the number one exporter into the United States, it's now Mexico. Well, if you had looked at the data for years, if you had looked at Mexico and Canada, you would have seen that this is our natural trade partner. And by the way, why do you want to look at it that way? Because companies that are based in North America, the average number of times before a finished product is ready to go to the consumer, the ultimate consumer, 10 times. It could start in the United States, goes up to Canada, comes back to the United States, go back down to Mexico. The parts come from various places and so on. So I look at what's happening in North America as something that's critical. So far, Mexico's looking great. Canada's looking great. So I would be concerned less about that than I am about some of our trade partners in Europe and some of our trade partners in Asia.
What's your view on small banks?
Small banks are worrisome to me, and thank you for raising that issue. Small banks have a very different business model. They have a different customer base than what we think of for the large banks. They're obviously heavily invested in their local communities, and they tend to have a lot of real estate. And so that is worrisome, number one. And number two, they tend to be less diversified. And so if their local community is not doing so well, they're kind of skunked, and that is problematic.
Colin?
It'd be good to see you again. Colin Coleman, formerly from Goldman Sachs, and now with CBS. Goldman Sachs actually produced a very interesting report called Path to 2075. Paints a picture of effectively India in the next 50 years adding $45 trillion of GDP, Africa adding 41 trillion, and China and the US each adding less than Africa, which is quite a remarkable sort of vision. How do you relate to that? Second part of that is, are you worried about global protectionism and effectively the war between China and the US to disrupt supply chains and strategically try and defeat China's innovation? And then thirdly, a lot of people I'm hearing are saying two things. One, on the medical side that there's going to be a lot of discovery and a lot of breakthroughs to prolong productivity, prolong life, which is going to be a source of huge innovation, but like AI, but maybe less sexy than AI to focus on. And the second, that China is one of the most undervalued markets in the world today.
So that was 4 questions. I can still count. Okay.
From your point of view, is China not actually the contrarian bet in the markets today?
Okay. All wonderful questions, but nevertheless, I will try to answer them quickly so that we can move on to some other people. Number one, I'm not going to comment on specifically the Goldman Sachs report, other than to say 20 years ago there was a report that said exactly the same thing with regard to the best opportunities being Africa and India, and I won't repeat what happened there. But yes, I do think there are some terrific opportunities. India in particular interests me. We're talking about the fastest growth in middle income people than anywhere in the world. We're talking about capital becoming available and so on. What I worry about with regard to India is, of course, the mismatch, the incredible amounts of inequality in the country. And what we know, of course, is that over the last century, the countries that have done the best are the ones where middle income grows. And so far, India is aiming to do that, and it's fits and starts. But could there be great opportunities there? Yes. There are, some obstacles in the way. Africa has been an area that has disappointed investors for a long, long time. As you well know, there have been efforts made, including at Goldman Sachs, to work in Africa, South Africa, Nigeria, portions of North Africa, and so on. I think there could be enormous opportunity there, but a lot of this is going to have to be done with the international community and with some of the multilateral economic institutions that I mentioned previously. But is there a need? Absolutely, there is a need, and it goes back to your fourth question about health. I think one of the main obstacles thus far for growth in Africa has been adequate nutrition, adequate health distribution, and so on. And that's why I think the multilateral institutions need to be involved there. You also asked question number 3, protectionism. Yes, I am concerned about protectionism. When I spoke a few moments ago about concerns I have about the trade, I'm concerned about protectionism. And some of it, by the way, is coming from the United States. Things get done for political reasons, but we also need to recognize that we are, because of AI and because of some other things, we're in a point where protection of IP is absolutely essential. I don't know that we figured out how to do it. So, for example, you've got the sanctions on China with regard to the chips that are needed for Gen AI, but they're getting the chips from other places. And Pierre has some great data basically showing that the Chinese are stockpiling those chips when they can get them. So they're buying them even before they need them because they're concerned that they won't have supply. So yeah, I think that trade protectionism is potentially always something of risk to long-term growth. Nevertheless, there have to be concerns about national interest, IP, and so on. And finally, with regard to health, by the way, am I talking too fast? I'm a native New Yorker, so I could do that. By the way, this is only half as quickly as I can speak. Biotech and other aspects of health to me are exciting areas, and I would broaden it out, per your question about Africa, to ag tech as well. When we think about ag tech, we think about all those cool John Deere tractors that are out there, and they've got the GPS, and it tells them exactly when they should fertilize and exactly when they should irrigate, and so on and so on. There's also enormous use for ag tech in areas of the world where there is food insufficiency. And there is enormous food insufficiency in places like Africa and a few other places around the world, including South Asia. And I see enormous opportunity, whether they are commercial opportunities per se, we'll let other people worry about it. You were asking about the commercial opportunities, and I see it very much so in biotech. The mRNA platforms that generated vaccines years more quickly than we might have expected. You know, I know it's politically charged. I think the COVID vaccines were a medical miracle. Normally, something like that would take 10 years or longer to develop using the old technologies. They were developed in under a year. I think it was a great success of the Trump administration. The same platform can be used to develop other medications, other vaccines. We also have the new CRISPR technologies, which are essential, precision medicine, and so on. I think that we are on the cusp of some really exciting things, and yes, I see investment opportunity there. However, when we look at stock markets and we look at health or we look at biology, what we're looking at are a lot of these healthcare systems, hospital systems that are, shall we say, in some cases, quite unattractive in the way they are run. They're not providing the services that they need to be providing. And I will throw into that as well a lot of the health insurance schemes that really need to be revamped. There's so much more to be said about that, so I've just thrown out some tidbits, and I hope that gives you all a sense of some thoughts.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on the national debt levels, and in particular more on the geopolitical implications of that for the U.S., and secondly, if there's a long-term resolution, would that be higher tax rates for future generations?
I think the debt level is too high. I could stop right there, but I won't. There are a whole series of other questions to be asked, and you asked a lot of the right ones. One question is, what are we doing with that money, right? If we're using the money, for example, to invest in future growth, then I'm all for it. If we're using it to make sure that people are well educated, that we have the right kind of equipment, that we are investing in the right technologies and so on, then I see a payback. So that and return. So I think that that's great, number one. Number two, how much of it is a problem, the high debt? There are people who have been arguing for almost 30 years that it's a problem. We haven't had a problem yet. The dollar is the dominant currency in the world, and so we still have a lot of demand out there for U.S. Treasury securities. It hasn't bit us to this point. That doesn't mean it won't. But I take a look at the arguments that were made about the Japanese economy as well. Japanese economy also has a very high debt to GDP ratio, and the argument is, well, they're self-funding. So it doesn't really hurt them. Everything's in yen, so it doesn't matter. At some point, it does matter. At some point, you have to be borrowing money that is going for good purpose and so on. So how do you get out of this mess? One way that we have gotten out of the mess partially we've grown out of the mess. Okay, so if your population grows and average income levels rise and therefore tax base increases, that's kind of a nice way to do it. Second way that some countries have tried to do it is you inflate your way out of it. I don't think this Fed is going to let us do that. So the question about are they going to relinquish the 2% rate? I think that we're going to try to avoid inflating our way out of it, but that's always a possibility. The other is, do we raise taxes? There's a very interesting book that was written by a Columbia professor, Michael Greitz, who talks about the way we have hollowed out our tax system. There are so many ways to get around paying taxes and so on. that the tax collection in the United States is actually quite inefficient, and if we look at effective tax rates, not statutory rates, but effective tax rates in the U.S. are actually quite low. And should they be raised? And how should they be raised? I think it's an important question to be asked. And then there's the question of what are we spending the money on? We all know about the dreaded word of entitlements. We have a problem now related to the so-called entitlements, read that as Social Security, Medicare, for the baby boom generation. I will just point out that the peak of the baby boom was 1957, so we knew 65 years ago when there was going to be a problem. We've not really done anything about it, have we? Or have we? There are a few things. Many years ago, there was something called the Greenspan Commission, in which Alan Greenspan worked with a bipartisan group in terms of making adjustments to Social Security that put it back on a right path. We've also, in some ways, slowed down the growth rate in Medicare by introducing Obamacare. This is something that's not well understood, so let me spend a moment on it. I don't think it comes as a surprise to anybody that the single most expensive year for the government for covering anybody is the last year of life. I don't think I need to go into detail about why that might be. The thing that surprises everybody is the second most expensive year for the government to cover somebody under Medicare is not the year before they die, but the first year they're on Medicare. Why? Because in a country that doesn't have universal health care coverage, many people were delaying their medical care until they had Medicare coverage. So somebody turns 65, they get Medicare, all of a sudden they get a knee replaced or a hip replaced, or they go for the full physical. There are also terrible instances where people delayed their cardiac care or their pulmonary care, and they came into the system kind of sick. Since Obamacare was implemented and healthcare coverage became more universal, not totally, but more universal in the country, actually Medicare expenditures have not risen as much as had been expected. So what we're seeing in terms of the aggregate government debt data is that Medicare is not as big of a drain as had been projected. So that's, I'm not saying it solves the problem, but it's something that was a pleasant surprise for people who work the numbers. How do you put that all together and say, what do we do? First of all, we have to be honest about where the money is coming from, where the money is going, and what our national priorities are. I'll conclude my comment by saying the following. A nation that prioritizes spending on older people, mainly because they vote, and doesn't prioritize spending on kids, education, health, and nutrition for young kids, that's a mistake, because you need that younger generation to be well educated and in position to help the economy grow.
Abby, thank you so much.
I hope you enjoyed hearing from Professors Abby Cohen and Pierre Yared. Stay connected with CBS to learn more about how the school is preparing students to stay informed and succeed. Thanks for listening.